When you think about each kid in America, millions will drop out each year. How many kids are lost in the foster care system? How many of these kids that never had a fighting chance, they are the bad kids. But we never take the time to realize how they're bad, where they learn this behavior. How we train our kids is how we prepare for the future. How many times we hear, this generation don't do this, they're lazy. The label is so deep that it never leaves. So I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry. You do not have to be what your environment is. Remember. Welcome to Beyond the Label podcast. My name is Jacob Spellis, and I got a topic today that's dear to my heart. How many times our kids act up? We see them in school settings, at home settings, and the first thing we do is call them a bad kid. Now think about that. You know, what does that do to somebody? When we think about the labeling theory, when we think about just labels in general, if a kid's been told hundreds of times they're a bad kid before they enter school, how do you think they perform then? You know, if I came from a family of swimmers, you know, and all we talked about was swimming, you go do this, you know, when they get ready to play sports, they're going to be ready. But if we tell our child, because they don't conform to the norms of society, that they're bad, they take that label on. And I think about this, how we handle health conditions, right? So we know that 90% of kids in our juvenile justice systems have experienced trauma, right? And they've probably done some stuff that's not good. They might have committed a status offense. They might have, you know, been unruly or anything like that. But when we think about it, how we study diseases, you know, in other areas, like let's just say physical health, right? We could have an outbreak of the measles, right? We would know immediately where it came from, how it started, who contacted. An epidemiologist would work with the health department. They would call everybody around. They would find exactly where it started, right? But when we think about that bad kid, and we know the data, the ACE screenings, the trauma, we know a kid probably didn't have a fair chance at a childhood. We don't think like that. We don't operate like that. We don't go to the core root cause and stop it at all costs, right? You know, we kind of live, you know, best way in society where we rather pay for windshields than seatbelts. So when we think about each kid in America, millions will drop out each year. How many kids are lost in the foster care system? How many of these kids that never had a fighting chance, that were just, be honest, just born in a battle, you know? They are the bad kids, but we never take the time to realize how they're bad, where they learn this behavior, right? We always say it takes a village to raise a kid or something like that, right? But why do we blame this one kid? So when you think about my experience, I was very smart, I feel like, in school, and I always struggled with reading, you know? And you know, I would get good grades, good scores in other topics, you know, but when it came to reading, I would fail. So the first thing they went to is that I'm cheating actually in the other topics, because there's no way you could do math but can't read, you know? And it wasn't until maybe 5th grade, 6th grade, give or take, that I was put like IEP or diagnosed with something that, you know, some teacher took the time to sit down with me. I remember she gave me a book to read, and I read the book, and she told me to comprehend, you know, how to report back what I learned. And I knew nothing. I just made it up because I was so used to not being able to read that I could forecast a good story, you know? Years later, when I found out she had dyslexia, I knew it at a young age, because just the way she wrote. She still does have really good handwriting, right? So, you know, you can't tell sometimes, but when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, she has it. So kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, I just told my wife, like, we need to instill confidence in her, you know, because you're not gonna get the resources in school to really help you. There's so many types of dyslexia. There's so many different ways. And I remember, you know, me and what worked for me, and the teacher, I remember, it was like right before COVID shutdowns. And during the shutdowns, like the day before, I think it was like a March or something like that, we were supposed to get my daughter some help, but the teacher was like, no, just give them a bunch of confidence. My wife was, I feel like, a little upset, but, it was true. How we train our kids is how we prepare for the future. So if we have a generation where we think they're lazy, right? Like how many times we hear, this generation don't do this, and they might have trends and stuff like that, but we're not empowering the youth, right? So when we go back to that label, a bad kid, it's proven. They take on that image, right? If you're an athlete, if you're whatever stereotypes you have in high school, same thing with the outcast. The bad kids becomes who you are, So when I think about how we study other diseases, how we get to the root cause, why aren't we doing the same thing with our youth, And it's a lot harder than just theories. A lot of people always have, well, if we had more money, we could do this, or if I was running it, nothing's easy. Like in life, when you think about macro problems, I consider myself a macro practitioner. It's hard. These are just theories, You want to start a kids program, how do you get the parents involved? They don't even have maybe a lot of active role, or you got a mom working 2-3 jobs just to put food on the table, and you're trying to put on an event. But when I think about that bad kid label, are we really looking into this child's eyes and see what's going on? Because a lot of times, kids just get other labels, maybe misdiagnosed, ADHD. I've seen all type of stuff, conduct disorder because they didn't follow directions, or, they just get this label and they go on, and these turn into something. And sometimes it breaks my heart because I have some really good friends, Rich and Yvonne, and they always told me, because I would tell my daughter one time when she was real young, 2, 3, one time I said, what did I say? I said, she's either going to be the president or prison, the way she keeps going, and he took me aside and he was like, hey, don't even put that in her head. You should have just said the president. Why would you even make prison an option? I was like, oh, I was just being funny. And he was like, no. There are no bad kids. And I thought, no, they're lying. There's some bad kids. I know some bad kids, and the more and more I kept thinking about it, no, it's just society and how we treat them, how we build them up. We should be empowering. Like, kids make bad choices. Like, kids' conscious is even developed to age 7, and you can't even be incarcerated after a certain age, depending on your state, because of their thinking. So why are kids in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade getting suspended, out of school, no support? We know they have a bad family life, no support. But what are we doing? We can solve other diseases. We got COVID right away. There were record vaccines, record time for getting stuff together. They shut everything down. But when I think about the disease of addiction, when I think about mental health disorders, we're behind. We don't have a lot of great data systems that doesn't go off just self-reporting. We don't have sometimes, some risk calculators that maybe can predict some of these things, And again, I don't have all the answers. I run a counseling agency, and I understand, everything sounds labeled, but I've been real caught up on bad kid. Myself personally, I went from bad kid to community leader to father to, you name it, social worker, just a lot of things, and how does somebody, so let's say you're watching this video and you've been labeled bad kid, never be nothing, just like your dad, how do you really take what people have been telling you and create a completely different story, The real thing's got to come internal. Like even today, I was, where was I was at? I was telling the guys here, a story like one time I was seeing a psychiatrist or maybe getting a second opinion on something, and they immediately jumped on the screen. It was a telehealth appointment, and they were like, no medicine. And I was like, what the hell? What are you talking about? no medicine. I was like, I wasn't trying to get medicine. I was just trying to get some clarity, you know what I mean, for it's just a mood disorder. I was just wondering about, and, they're like, no medicine. I was like, you can't get nothing cool with that. You don't get Xanax for that, And at that moment, she said, look at your chart, something like that. And I said, wow, I'm a professional. I went to the top school in the country for social worker. I got trained by top experts in the field and top social work. I've done research. I own my agency. I mean, I hire literally people like this person, and that label still goes on, right? As a bad kid, it goes through that. I even remember during COVID, I had cancer, and they just kept saying I had a nasal polyp because when I was a kid, I got in too many fights, and I was like, I don't know, that don't even make sense. But when I would go see the doctors, they'd be like, no medicine, and I'm like, what, antibiotics? Doesn't make too much sense, But that label as a kid carried on to me, You got to think about every kid. Now, I'm not saying we don't keep these, but has a school record. So think about a kid who maybe has a military family. They've moved base to base over and over, and on paper, they might look like they have no stability. They haven't been to school sometimes, but we don't realize their family condition. A parent is serving our country, We might have a kid who, this happens all the time in my agency, like the school calls us, we don't know what's going on. They're shut down, they're sleeping in class, and my team will have to advocate on the behalf, like, hey, I'm sorry, but the parents have been fighting from 12 a.m. to 5 a.m. They're breaking stuff, the dad's leaving, or maybe the parents on drugs or something. But when that kid comes to school, all you see is them sleeping, all you see them not paying attention. But in reality, they're fighting wars at home that the teachers will never know about. And they're just worried about the test results, compliance, all that stuff. But how do we make kids conform to something? I kind of, look away from the question of what do you want to be when you grow up? Because most adults don't even know what they want to be when they grow up. We kind of live in a generation where, men are living home to their 26, 30 years old. People are having families later. I always think about, what was I doing yesterday? I was complaining, for really like 2 seconds. I was on a computer and I was looking at organic groceries that I just started, trying to eat healthier. And, for a second I started complaining, like, this is hard work. I got to pick between, these different salads and stuff. And then immediately I was like, Jake, grow up. Are you crying about picking out organic groceries, instead of going to, a war zone at Walmart? Like, grow up, Jake, Same thing when I think about how we deal with the kids, and the perspective is, are we chasing compliance, or are we inspiring kids to be the best for our workforce, Kids should have a lot more opportunities to fail, because the school system, and again, I'm no expert or have a PhD in education or even ran a school, but when I think about what do we do for those bad kids, if we have 1 million kids dropping out, but they have to get a GED to be successful, what are we doing to stop that person? What are we doing to stop kids that are labeled maybe in special education, maybe kids that are always in in-school suspension, Are we practicing restorative justice practices to maybe heal the kid and the family? Are we giving resources to that? Because a lot of times we put so much emphasis on teachers, and a teacher might have, I see this all the time in schools we work with, they might have 25 kids in one classroom, and they're not equipped or have the resources. They're trying to teach the curriculums and stuff. And when I think about those kids that are just left behind, what happens to them? The label is so deep that it never leaves. So even to this day, I'll encounter, just dealing with, I don't know, certain medical fields, will diagnose me or label me this, or, people discredit my success because I dropped out of high school or something of that nature, or even like, I'll show up somewhere and, I was talking to a brother, like a real estate person, and then, I was trying not to be rude, but I run a larger, rather, company, over 50 employees. I have other multiple companies. I have investments, and she was like talking down on me. I felt like putting an offer in this house, and I was like, you need to have this, you need to have, your credit, you need to have all this. And I was like, it's a commercial loan. We're going to be fine. But then I thought about it. She was looking into my background. So she assumed that I didn't understand the business knowledge or anything like that. Or, so sometimes people hide instead of using layman's terms, they use bigger terms. But when you think about our kids, I hate the term bad kid, because we know the brain will develop. We know that resources are there. We know that we have to teach our kids stuff now that will apply later in their life, but think about that as a parent. When you call your kid a bad kid, what is the point of that? Like one time my daughter, when I was, maybe she was like 2, and I was driving in my car, and I, she said, oh shit. And I was like, at first I got mad at her, but I thought, that's my fault. She heard me cussing. Where would she have learned that at? She's always with me and my family. So when we think about some of the habits that we pass on to the kids, and you guys know, it's like, man, I'll never do what my dad did. I'll never do what my mom did. But then you say the same stuff over and over again. Sometimes these are generational curses. Sometimes these are labels that were put on our own kid, but what are we doing to inspire the next generation? I never see older people, maybe I miss it, but these kids are so smart. No, it's normally like they have no work ethic. they just care about their phones. They're lazy. They're entitled. They're all this stuff. But every generation will say that about the next generation. Because I remember being a millennial growing up, and we got the worst of the worst, softest of the softest, whatever generations after us. Maybe I can't keep up with Z, maybe something, no, those kids are the worst, those are that. But imagine if we took the approach to inspire them with the tools they have. It's not their fault that they got technology advances, It's crazy. We probably live in a world where, the kids are, writing papers in ChatGPT, and then the teachers are grading the shit in ChatGPT and giving back responses in AI and stuff. And, or I see parents yelling at their kids, don't be on their phones, I'm guilty myself, and I'm on my phone, so a lot of this stuff is cool, you have tablets and all that other stuff, but what's the standard we set for our kid, and I challenge you this week, as a parent, and I'll take the challenge myself too, is only say positive stuff for your kids. So a lot of the research, I remember being in school, would state like even kids in different social economic classes. So if we look at kids in poverty, if we look at kids in middle class, kids in upper class, I think maybe it was families and homes over maybe 250,000, and they study these families. And the words that were spoken into them were crazy. I might mess up the terms here, but it was like command words, like go, stop, this, A kid in poverty would typically have like 13, 14 command words to stop before something maybe loving or positive would say, right? And the middle class is a little lower. And then, the more money they got, could have been doing better. Now, this is not the case for all families. We have rich families that struggle, middle class, lower class. A struggle is a struggle. But when you think about just the language that's spoken to a kid, and then they go to a broken school system, right? You go to a inner city school system, and the teacher only has a year experience. They're just trying to get the benefit of teaching in the school before they get a better job. It's lower funded. They don't really maybe believe in the students or understand the community. That has a huge effect on the label that you carry in society. So for the individual that's going through being called a bad kid, like myself, even to this day, it's always like, man, you were terrible in school. It's like, yeah, but I'm successful now. You were terrible in school. That image of what people have in your head will never change unless you take on that same label for yourself and turn it into something positive. I'm not a bad kid. I was just misguided, flat out. I was just misguided, I just didn't have the right resources, right? If we're not programming our kids' GPS and go into a direction that's positive, we're setting them up for failure, So take that today and really think about the way we inspire our youth. And for the youth that are labeled bad kids, you're not a bad kid. You might have made some mistakes. You might have done this. You might have been put in the wrong environments where you had to survive and fight, and you've seen drugs and domestic violence at a young age, I'm sorry you had to go through that. Young lady, young man, I'm sorry, You do not have to be what your environment is. Remember, the environment is a product of us. What we do, how we take back our communities. We cannot wait for other leaders or people that get voted in and work part-time to make decisions to change our lives. We have to start with us. We cannot change the past. We can only change the future. You are not a bad kid. You made some bad choices. You might have some bad guidance, and especially now in the world of social media, we can look that up, but we have so many homes that have been broken, fathers not in the homes, maybe mothers not in the homes, Really think about that, how we speak to ourselves and the youth, Really think about who you could be, You're not bad. You're not bad. So, today I just want to just take time and think about and reframe, the people that have been through stuff, You got to have a more positive outlook. Like, it can be as simple as just writing in your mirror, I'm a good person. Because I see so many times that people be afraid to accept a award or a compliment or something because they don't feel entitled. So it starts feeling that the world of abundance is yours if you go after it. You deserve everything that's coming. Faith without works is dead. And if you're putting in the actual work every single day, you can rise above any single label. So thank you so much for listening today. I greatly appreciate the support we're getting. We're actively looking for people to showcase their stories, looking for leaders in certain spaces, and we're going to start working on society problems and labels that we see every day. And if you've reached a certain point in your career or story or healed from a trauma that nobody thought you could, we would love to have you on our podcast as we go through this next year, 2026. Please subscribe and download on Spotify, Apple, wherever the hell it's at. So I'll see you next time.